From the unbowed, unbent, unbroken, and its ridiculous fight sequence, to the absolutely excruciating series finale that was The Iron Throne. These are the Game of Thrones episodes that really pissed fans off. And I think we need to take a look at the moment the cracks first appeared. Unbowed, Unbent, Unbroken was the first truly bad episode of the series. Up until this point, Game of Thrones had been an absolutely spectacular show. Sure, Season 5 took a while to get the pace going, but most of the episodes were rock solid. That is, until we got to Episode 6. First, the Sand Snakes were really done dirty this season. In the books, they were lethal assassins who learned to fight from Oberyn Martell himself, but they somehow got bested by a one-armed Jaime. I guess he had Bronn to back him up, but even so.
To get around the death thing, but I'm doing all right so far.
You're doing okay so far.
It was pretty weird that these supposedly skillful fighters were taken apart so easily. What's more, this is the episode that gave us that notorious scene featuring Sansa, Theon, and Ramsay Bolton. I'm not gonna get into the gory details, but I think we can all agree that terribly violent scene added nothing to any of the characters' arcs. We already knew how cruel Ramsay could be, and there was no need to depict it so graphically. To make things worse, this wasn't even the first time the show used gratuitous violence against women for shock value. Breaker of Chains wasn't a terrible episode overall, but Jaime's terrible actions against Cersei made no sense. Look, I get it. Game of Thrones is a show that depicts horrible people doing absolutely evil things. But I question the decision to show Jaime forcing himself on Cersei.
In Winterfell and says, "This is my Winterfell, not yours," and stabs me in the heart. And so I thought it was a great way to go. Right.
For one thing, this is just not how it played out in the books. Cersei may have been hesitant at first, but she eventually gave in to temptation. She had agency, and she gave her consent. I guess the showrunners didn't get the memo, or they just thought that casual violence against women was no big deal. Maybe they felt like it would make the scene more memorable. And they actually succeeded, but not in the way they'd hoped. The show was at its best when it stayed true to George R.R. Martin's vision. Unfortunately, things started to get pretty awful once they ran out of books to adapt. Season 8 started off all right, but The Long Night was a huge disappointment. Don't get me wrong, this is by no means the worst episode of the show, cause we got to see a massive battle play out at least. But there were some issues that really spoiled the experience for fans. For one thing, could anybody even see a single thing during the battle? I get that it took place in the dead of night, but the murky cinematography made the action pretty tough to follow. This was supposed to be the big finale to the big White Walker storyline, but every single element that fans had been looking forward to was handled so poorly. Like, I'm not the only one that was looking forward to seeing the Night King's ice dragon in action. He successfully turned one of Daenerys' loyal fire breathers to his side, and there was no telling what he'd do with this newfound power. But instead of getting an epic extended battle sequence, the dragon shows up for a few scenes, only to be defeated surprisingly easy, and we never even hear about him again.
Sci-fi novel, one of the original, from which all the shows we love probably spurn from, is Dune.
To make things worse, the conclusion to the whole White Walker narrative was utterly ridiculous. I mean, the Night King was an antagonist that the show had been building up for years. He'd managed to reunite the creatures of the night and launch a campaign to conquer the land of the living. And he got bested by a little sneak attack from Arya? Like, seriously? All she had to do to defeat him was a little bluff and some sleight of hand? Come on! Anyway, I wasn't the only one who was foaming at the mouth after all of this played out. Fans were furious that the storyline they'd been looking forward to for nearly a decade finished with such an anticlimax, and Season 8 only got worse from there. The Last of the Starks ruined all hope that the season would be any good. After a couple of decent opening episodes, Season 8 finally concluded the show's main storyline with The Long Night. It was rushed at best, and most fans were confused about what would come next. Anyone that was hopeful got a real wake-up call when The Last of the Starks aired. Much like the last episode, the pacing seemed really off. Instead of the gradual exposition that made the show famous, The Last of the Starks looked like it was trying to sprint to the finish line. I mean, just look at what they did to Jaime and Brienne. The romantic tension between the two had been building for a couple of seasons. Jaime finally admitted his true feelings to Brienne, only to run off back to King's Landing like 10 minutes later. Jaime wasn't the only character acting strangely either. Most of the characters made choices that were absolutely baffling. Like Daenerys didn't seem to remember that the Iron Fleet was approaching, and Tyrion had lost pretty much all of his bite, practically begging Cersei to do the right thing instead of coming up with some kind of plan himself. By this point, we all knew that things were going to end badly, but I doubt anyone could have predicted just how awful the story was going to get. Nothing about the Bells made sense. Least of all, Daenerys' actions. Once the White Walker threat was neutralized, the characters of the show set their sights on King's Landing. Cersei was the last foe that they needed to vanquish, and there were all sorts of ways in which everything could have played out. D.B. Weiss and David Benioff ruined their reputations because of one crazy choice. Daenerys decided to go on a rampage, slaughtering thousands of innocent people in the process. Nothing about this lined up with what we already knew about Khaleesi. She'd always been portrayed as compassionate and kind. To be fair, there were some signs that she'd go the Mad Queen route, but the writers of the show should have started building up to that at least from the start of the season. Instead, they stuffed Daenerys' sudden, shocking descent into madness into a single episode. Jaime and Cersei's death scene was also pretty bland, and there really isn't much to enjoy about this dreadful hour of TV. Most fans felt like things couldn't get much worse. But boy, how wrong were we? The Iron Throne is probably the worst series finale of all time. We were all pretty numb after watching the excruciating penultimate episode. Expectations were about as low as they could possibly be. Yet this last episode somehow still managed to fail us. Jon Snow's decision to kill Daenerys made sense, I guess. But why on earth was Bran chosen to be king? The kid was absent for the entirety of Season 5. We barely learned anything about him. But that didn't stop Tyrion from nominating him. And don't even get me started on how bad Tyrion was after the writers ran out of source material. Instead of the shrewd strategist he'd been in the first half of the series, Tyrion turned into a bumbling idiot who could never do anything right. And as for Jon, he ended up right back where he started, rejoining the Night's Watch at the Wall. It was a disappointing end to a disappointing season, and it ruined the legacy of the show in the process. Those folks were the Game of Thrones episodes that pissed the fans off.